Welcome to the HR Uprising Podcast. This podcast series explores HR hot topics and challenges through conversations with relevant experts and real-life HR, learning, and OD professionals. The HR Uprising is about learning through collaboration and evidence-based action. We want colleagues to have the confidence and skills to rise up through their organizations by delivering real, lasting business value. Now, introducing your host, chartered psychologist, experienced change agent, entrepreneur, speaker, and coach, Lucinda Carney.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the HR Inspired Podcast, which is aimed at forward-thinking HR, OD and learning and development professionals. My name is Lucinda Carney and I'm the podcast host, and you can hear there's some interesting sound all around. I'm not sure if that's a child or a swan in the background. So today I've got a very exciting guest from my point of view personally, and a really lovely location. So we're by Tower Bridge. So there may be some background ambience and sounds all around, which are great. But the person that I've got with me today, and I'm delighted really, this is my first conversation with, so I'm very grateful to Professor Rob Briner. I'm saying Briner as opposed to Briner, that I've been pronouncing incorrectly for many years. So Professor Briner he's Professor of Organisational Psychology at Queen Mary University of London. He's also Scientific Director at the Centre for Evidence-Based Management, and he was topped, has been in HR Magazine's Most Influential Thinkers a number of times, and you were voted number one in 2016. And in our sort of pre-chats, I was saying that, a number of years ago, you were actually my professor when I did my master's, although we never met because I did it all through correspondence. So it's actually great to personally meet and be able to ask some of the questions that I've always wondered about. But I feel, can I tell you Rob? As opposed
of course. That's my name.
Yeah. So I feel that you're very visible and therefore a really great person to have on this show, someone who can help us with this crossover between academia and HR. And as you know, I said the purpose of this podcast for me is about, for us to improve our credibility, let's say, as HR professionals, it is about being more evidence-based and also more strategic. So I thought, who better to talk to than this?
Okay, thanks very much for having me on.
So appreciate your time. So in terms of evidence-based HR, would you like to explain what it is for the benefit of the podcast?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the short version is it's just about making more informed decisions both about what organisational problems and opportunities might be, and also better decisions or more informed decisions about what likely solutions or interventions should be. So that's the kind of simple, straightforward explanation. Better informed decision, nobody disagrees with that. Motherhood and apple pie, great. More technically, or in a bit more detail, I guess, what it means is using multiple sources of evidence. So for us in HR, it's typically our own experience as practitioners. Mm-hmm. It's stakeholders' perspective, so employees, senior managers, maybe customers. It is organisational data from inside the organisation, and fourth, it's scientific evidence. It's about bringing those four sources of evidence together, say both to understand problems and opportunities, and also to make decisions about likely interventions.
So I get the fact that we have those different sources of evidence, and I think back to my time as a practitioner, and I hope that the aeroplane going overhead isn't too distracting for the audience. I suppose if I'm really honest, I probably used stakeholder influence and maybe my own professional expertise. I think maybe a bit of organisation theories, a bit of reference to that. But scientific literature, I think is certainly, other than that I remembered from my qualifications, and maybe if you've done a CIPD course, the things that you've been taught, I think it's quite hard for you to get hold of that. So how do we do more of that?
It is hard to get hold of it, and I think it's also worth thinking about what are the differences between the way we normally seem to use evidence and evidence-based practice. So everybody uses evidence. You said, everybody does of different kinds. There may be some sources they don't use so much, partly because it's hard to access. I would also say that often organisational data is pretty hard to access. Yeah. So one difference is multiple sources. I think another difference is taking a structured approach. So you actually go step by step to, for example, asking questions, acquiring the evidence, critically appraising its quality, for example, as you go through a series of steps. And I think the other difference is it's about the attitude or approach you take. So typically we describe it as conscientious, explicit and judicious. Conscientious means you try, explicit means you write it down and encode it, and judicious means you judge quality. So I think in your example of your experience, I'm sure that's right, it's harder to get hold of the scientific evidence, but I also suggest probably like most people, most of us aren't that conscientious, explicit, judicious, so we don't follow an explicit process. We gather together bits of evidence. It may be good, it may be bad, it may be relevant, and we kind of put it into a pot and then try and make a decision. So you're right, there's an issue around getting hold of it, but I think that's not just about academic evidence. I think it's about other kinds of evidence, and I think there's also issues around understanding and critically appraising and judging its quality or trustworthiness.
So sort of being objective. So as opposed to almost going, actually, this is the solution I want to do. I'm going to try and find the evidence to back up that decision I've already made.
Yes.
Taking a step back and having an objective, evaluative process of going through a number of stages. So what is the best evidence out there, for example?
From all those sources, indeed. From all those sources.
So let's take a real example. So a typical scenario, I'm in an organisation and the MD or the sales director has said to me, need a development programme.
Right.
Our guys haven't got the right skills.
Right.
So what would be an evidence-based approach to me doing that?
Okay, so the evidence-based approach is, so the evidence-based approach first is to say, what's the problem?
Yeah.
So just because someone thinks people don't have the right skills doesn't mean they do or they don't. So you'd also always take a step back and say, what's the problem or opportunity here? And it was only if you did a proper assessment, I guess, of salespeople's skills, and indeed whether they were somehow not good enough, and indeed whether they're not being good enough was leading and an explanation for their poor, whatever that means, sales performance. If you're pretty confident that was the case, again, using evidence from those multiple sources, you then go on to say, okay, so it appears to be the case that lack of skills or limited skills is a cause of this serious organisational problem. Therefore, what's the most likely intervention? Now, your CEO, whoever said to you, it's training, but maybe that's not the best intervention. Maybe it's selection. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's giving people more skill, more resources they need to use the skills they already have, or other ways of enhancing skills that don't necessarily involve development. So crucially, with an evidence-based practice, the key thing you start with is not a sort of solution or let's do something about this. You start off with this. What is the actual problem? And I think if someone says to me, what's the one thing you could do in HR or management or any discipline to be more evidence-based? I think the main tip would be focus on what the problem is, because we're very keen in moving into solution mode, implement mode, roll things out mode. And usually I think that's the main stumbling block, is that we roll things out, we do stuff. People have no problem doing stuff, being very active, spending money, rolling out programs and so forth. But what they're not so good at, what we seem to find really difficult, is focusing on what the issue is. So that would be my starting point. In the example you gave, is to go back and say, let's find out what the problem is first.
And I suppose, so I can think of a couple of examples there, which I'll reflect back and see whether they would be good examples. So certainly, as being someone I was heading up learning and development, I do remember without a shadow of a doubt, in 80% of cases when someone comes and says, I need this training course, you go, okay, so what is it what's the actual problem? What's it? And you would find out that actually they didn't need that training course at all. So that would be an example of actually diagnosing what the problem was further. In an example with a sales one, I remember we did have a situation with a sales program, and actually there was some psychometrics out there which had done some profiling. It was profiling about different roles. So there was an evidence there of whether there was a gap against the profile. Now, of course, you'd have to say, what's the evidence for that profile being legitimate? It came from quite a decent psychology house, actually. But, that would be an example of evidence, and the fact that these people went through a psychometric profile and there was actually a gap against that desired profile. Let's say a solution salesperson, so there appeared to be a gap if that was the desired role. Now, I guess one of the conclusions I'm also thinking is it's not just one solution. There isn't really one solution, is there, when you're talking about people and interventions? That might just help a bit, but actually that person might need to know to do things differently, or you probably need multiple solutions.
Potentially you do, and also the key thing is how actionable or changeable these things are. So, for example, you might identify, say, personality or some job attitude or whatever it is as being quite relevant to causing or affecting the outcome you want. But if it's effectively not changeable, in terms of the concept of bang for your buck, then don't go crazy trying to change that one thing, because it's actually really hard to change. So it's partly about multiple solutions potentially, and also what is actually changeable. Lots of things are quite hard to change. So why focus on things it's hard to change? So
what do you subscribe to the whole thing about strengths versus, or looking at in terms of looking at people? So I'm going off on one slightly in terms of, should you be focusing on being better at the things you do well as opposed to trying to close gaps? What's your? I don't know. I actually don't know the evidence on that one.
Me neither.
Okay, we'll have to go and look that one up. I'll find someone else on that one. So in terms of we've talked about if we were going to look at things, we should try and access some scientific literature and actually maybe just try a bit harder. But it's really also about being sequential and measured in our approach.
And it's also crucial about looking at other sources as well, because scientific evidence in itself is meaningless, like any sources.
Yeah, I just what it's meaningless, but also there may not be scientific evidence for the thing that you're trying to deliver, because actually the academic studies don't necessarily correlate with what we're trying to do in business.
And that's fine, and that's true of any of those four sources of evidence. You may lack professional expertise, you may have very limited organisational data, you may have not talked to stakeholders. So not having evidence is not in itself a barrier to evidence-based practice. I know that sounds a bit contradictory. It's not. It's about a process.
It's the fact that you've actually thought about it, tried and taking a step back, being objective. Okay, well that means that makes it sound a bit more reasonable and achievable potentially. Okay, so as I've got the luxury of having a professor sitting with me, and I know in terms of your role with SEBMA, I wondered, I'm a member of that, although I have to say, again, searching through some of the literature is sometimes still quite challenging to get to what you're trying to find. But I mean, what is your recommendation for if I'm an HR professional or an L&D OD and I want to be more scientific in my approach? Yeah. How can I do that?
Well, I think I'd always say, first of all, look for what the problem is first. Don't go look for scientific evidence and then decide your problem is one that can be fixed by this bit of evidence. Start with the problem itself. In terms of generally accessing scientific evidence, the Centre for Evidence-Based Management, if you remember, enables you to have access to quite a few databases, which is useful. Increasingly, with the open access movement in terms of publishing, as a general member of the public, it's easier now. It's still hard, but it's easier to get access to scientific articles. Similarly, if you're a member of some professional bodies such as CIPD or the British Psychological Society, there's access there. There's also things like ResearchGate. So there's a whole kind of plethora now of different ways. They're often not always as convenient of getting hold of that stuff. So I think getting hold of it is sort of easier. I think what's more difficult is two things. One is judging its quality, and that's what's quite hard to do.
So just because it's academic doesn't mean it's good?
Not at all. No, it doesn't. Absolutely not. So there's some very poor quality research.
So do you think about the MMR type issues that can have stuff that's out there? Yeah.
For example, yeah. So there's very poor quality research, probably some very high quality journals. It's very hard to judge. It's very hard even for the scientists to judge, never mind someone who isn't trained in science. So judging the quality is difficult. And I think the other thing is, which is I think quite an Achilles heel sometimes for people that want to use scientific evidence, is we're not on the whole interested in single scientific studies or even a couple of scientific studies. What's important, and that's true of any of those areas of evidence, is the body of evidence. Mm-hmm. So talking to one person as a stakeholder is great, but it is only one person. Looking at some organisational data is great, but it's only maybe one a year. So it's all right, but it's not really giving you the picture. The same is true of scientific evidence. You need to really pull together everything that's relevant, and that's I would say not impossible. It's very difficult for someone working on their own to do that, to find the other stuff, pull it together, and say overall this is the evidence base for this particular proposition or problem or hypothesis or whatever it happens to be. So I think that's the real challenge as well. In other fields, such as medicine, for example, policing, there are national and international bodies set up to actually summarise that research into something called a systematic review, or something like a meta-analysis if the question lends itself to meta-analysis. So I think, again, on the SEBMA website, you'll see some of the guidelines include how to find things like meta-analyses and systematic reviews, because they're not single studies. They're trying to pull together lots and lots of studies, which is the key thing. So that's a tricky thing, and I think so there are lots of, as it were, partly barriers of access, but then barriers of aggregation and barriers of comprehension and judgment there as well as just access.
So from the time poor HR professional or L&D professional, look for systematic reviews or meta-analysis.
I mean, you can even just go onto Google Scholar,
read the abstract,
type in the thing you're interested in, type in systematic reviews and meta-analysis. That will help. The problem we have in areas of management and HR is there just aren't very many systematic reviews yet. That's changing a bit, but there just aren't many around. The problem with the meta-analyses is you get the garbage in, garbage out problem that it's true of systematic reviews as well to some extent, but broadly speaking, meta-analyses, of course, can only pull together studies that have addressed the same question in more or less the same way. So it's true you get a lot of data, whether it's any good, whether it's really telling you much scientifically is another issue. So searching for systematic reviews and meta-analyses is probably a better place to start, where it is, than just searching for single studies.
So, sorry, the difference between a meta-analysis and a systematic review?
So meta-analysis is quantitative for a start, and it's pulling together statistically lots of results from similar studies, for example, job satisfaction, job performance, that measure those things in very similar ways. A systematic review can address a much wider range of questions, including qualitative, more questions, and it doesn't necessarily do a meta-analysis or statistical summary. It pulls together the findings, perhaps from quite different kinds of studies.
Okay.
And often systematic reviews don't depend on having a big body of evidence there to begin with. So you can do systematic review and actually find there's only three publications on it, 3 scientific studies. That's fine. But systematic reviews tell you what we know and don't know about something. Meta-analyses are only possible. You've already got quite a big quantity of data.
Okay. It tells you what's there. And also you said what's changed?
Open access movement. So essentially, and this is a very, very crude way of putting it, but essentially most academics, most scientists work in universities. They are paid already in their jobs by student fees, taxes, etc., depending where you work, research grants from governments. They write their research, they publish it, and then paradoxically perhaps, the publishers who get hold of it then charge universities and members of the public and other people to actually read it. So there's been an increasing movement to say, well, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It actually doesn't seem ethically right. And also, it's sort of a bit nuts. So there's been more of a move towards saying, recognising that publishers obviously add some value to that, is why should they be able to lock this stuff up behind a paywall? So there's been more and more of a move to sort of try and get away from that, make more stuff open access, and probably in 10, 20, 30 years' time, much of it will be completely free and open.
Because so for you, if you've published something and it's your name's on it, do you have the freedom to put it out there in the domain, or does the publisher stop you?
That's a great question with an extremely long answer.
Okay.
It depends.
Right.
On lots and lots and lots of stuff. Yes. Broadly speaking, yes. But it would have to be the version of the article before it was finally accepted for publication.
Okay, because they
There's
own
all
that
kind of
copyright
different types and levels of kind of access, open access.
Right. Because it is an interesting one. We were talking offline a bit, weren't we, about actually how academia is academia and then HR's over here, and actually the more, if they could merge better, you'd think it would be better, and this would be one of the
but to me it's less about merging, I think, academia and practice. To me it's more about trying to, if you like, encourage practitioners to be evidence-based. Mm-hmm. So of course researchers are practitioners too. Practitioners of science, are they evidence-based? Not particularly. So to me, the key thing is to the extent to which you believe in evidence-based practice or not, rather than whether you're a researcher or an academic or a practitioner in an organisation. That's the key distinction, I think. So merging, so particularly obviously academics are incentivised to do certain sorts of things. Practitioners are incentivised to do other kinds of things that are often quite different. But to me, it's not about merging these groups of people. It's about saying, how can people make better informed decisions? Not about the people, but about the institutions, I would say.
But you always think, therefore, the institutions should be asking for there to be research. I'm thinking, pharmaceutical industry, they've got a vested interest and they'll get research done in topics they want to. But I'm just thinking, pushing it the other way, as a practitioner, and I'll raise that pragmatic word, because I do remember using that on social media, and I think you took issue with it. And I was like, if you're in an organisation and your CEO is saying, I want a solution, and I'm going, well, it's got to be evidence-based and it's going to take me 3 months to gather the evidence, or there's no evidence because the things that people in academia have studied are not actually relevant to the problems in business. I mean, that would be my challenge. How could academia be more relevant to business, if that's a fair challenge? Yeah,
it is. I mean, I don't necessarily think it's academia's job to be relevant to business. In the same way, I don't think it's practitioners' job to be relevant to academia. I mean, they're just different.
But being evidence-based makes sense because you're a practitioner to deliver value to the business. So if being evidence-based, assuming there is evidence for being evidence-based, which is in there, then you're going to deliver more value to the business.
Yeah.
But then surely I don't really understand then, if you're an academic, why would you choose to study something then if it's not going to be relevant? If a business topic, if you're not
because I think there's certain things that determine scientific relevance and certain things that determine practical relevance. So you could be, for example, doing some incredibly scientifically relevant stuff, say on personality and behaviour, that in the end has no application at work.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it isn't important, isn't scientifically interesting, isn't scientifically valid, but it just may happen to have no application. Similarly, the problems business faces just may not be that important scientifically in another sense. So I think if anybody wants very kind of practice relevant research, I think that's a different kind of research from purely scientific research. So it's a bit like applied research. So another way of putting this, I suppose, is that if you want a piece of research that will directly help you with a business problem, it may be exactly the kind of research that will never get published in a scientific journal. Is it practically useful? Is it still science? Absolutely. And I think as time has gone on, academics across all fields are under pressure to publish certain kinds of articles. So, for example, if a researcher in HR, organisational psychology, did a piece of research that was practically incredibly useful, had a huge impact, it may well never get published in the journal because it's not novel, it doesn't have theory, it doesn't use cutting-edge methods. It will be seen as,
it's not scientifically interesting enough.
Yeah, or it's just too descriptive. Doesn't mean it isn't practically useful. So I think there's a kind of, not always, but there can be a kind of contradiction between what is useful in terms of some forms of practice and what is interesting and important in terms of science. And that's okay, I think, that's fine. But it's not a sense of sort of bridging a gap, is how people often put it. I think it's more a sense of always focusing what's the problem, what's the question you're trying to address, and looking around to try and find evidence, whatever kind of evidence it is, to help you make a more informed decision. I think how you get more, if you like, applied science done, the way I think universities are going, it's not going to happen there. So you might need intermediary organisations, you might need to train people in organisations, particularly big ones, to do it more themselves, you might need more consultancies who are good at doing applied research, those sorts of things that would actually help.
What about like organisations funding like MBA students or MSc students, or giving them sort of thesis rather than doesn't have to be big research? Is there ways there you can give them?
That's certainly possible. And again, you have this contradiction that sometimes the piece of it doesn't mean that you can't do both, of course, but it's often more work for the student. That the kind of research that would be acceptable for a master's dissertation, certainly a doctoral thesis, might not be practically that useful to the organisation. Right. So people end up doing parallel pieces of research. Yeah, it's doable, but it can be a bit more work. Yeah.
It's a bit of a dichotomy.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So on that then, this is a kind of link in my head, because I know that I'm going to go more into sort of HR terms and jargons and fads and things that I think you're great at calling out. And I thought I'm going to start with engagement, because I know you've got a view on that. And I'll just say, I remember when the company that I worked for, that Gallup was out there with lots of evidence, and very compelling evidence, to such the extent that, and I'm saying evidence in inverted commas, I don't know whether you would agree that it's that kind of evidence, for there being a direct line between employee engagement and productivity, profitability, etc., etc. Now, I feel that you have some alternative views to engagement. That isn't the whole story. I mean, it sold a lot of engagement surveys for Gallup. It was a great way forward, and I suppose that's where we have to be wary about evidence and the fact that it's sponsored by someone proprietary.
Yes.
What's your take on engagement?
Well, engagement is just an example. I guess there's hundreds of examples. It's just one. I think firstly you have to be very clear about what the claim is. So what's the claim being made? So often in the case of engagement, not just Gallup, more broadly, is that, for example, the claim is it has really strong causal effects on the organisational performance. Okay? Does it? I mean, what would constitute good? It's sure there's lots and lots of evidence, and it's true.
Is it causal evidence or is it correlation evidence?
It's nearly all correlational. So, and the same is true within sort of just within the scientific literature. You can say, look at job satisfaction and performance, and 95% of it's cross-sectional. So it depends what the claim is. If you say, is there an association between people saying they're satisfied at work and how they perform? Sure. Does it mean that people, if you increase job satisfaction, increase performance? Totally different claim. So having evidence and whether or not that evidence helps kind of establish whether a claim is valid and reliable is a completely different thing. So sure, there's often tons of evidence. The question is what the claim is. So I think in the case of engagement, what happened, I think we've kind of hit peak and gone over peak engagement now, but certainly when it was hitting its peak, maybe 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, I think the claims made were were very, very strong and quite clear. Things like, engagement, say in the UK, was linked to national productivity. Wow, amazingly strong claim. And as Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But the evidence wasn't extraordinary. It was actually quite mundane. There wasn't much of it. It wasn't very good quality to answer that question. So I think it's just one example of many where, there's lots of evidence, but it doesn't support those claims being made. Yeah.
I think engagement, I think one of the reasons that engagement was maybe grabbed upon as something is because it gave you something tangible as a metric if you're an HR person, you say, well, actually, that's a number.
Sure.
That I can increase that number from 3.2 to 3.6. Therefore, I'm doing a good job. Therefore, that's me directly.
Yeah, sure.
I'm in the fluffy HR. That's me directly affecting the business.
Yeah, I think I would agree. Again, I think so I wouldn't say it's tangible. I say it appears tangible. Because if you say, what does that number mean? I don't know.
Because actually, people metrics are really difficult. Attrition, finding those to do an HR scorecard, for example, to show your impact is quite challenging.
Yes,
those are the sort of things you have to look at.
Yeah, it is. And I think that it appears tangible. I think the idea of a single number was sort of important. And I think and it's probably still true now, I suppose, largely, that I think HR is always kind of quite keen to prove its value to the business. So maybe it tries to do that in ways that seem very headliney and possibly slightly exaggerate, what the value is by, as you say, looking at one number and saying it's linked to performance and so on. I mean, having said all this, and this is anecdotal, highly low quality evidence, when I've spoken to engagement managers and people who have engagement, or, employee engagement in the job title, and indeed, as you say, they're very concerned about the level. It's going up is good, going down is bad, etc., etc. I don't think I've ever met one who's actually ever linked that to business outcomes. They assume that because of other research out there, and broader claims being made, therefore it's going up, it must be good. If it's going down, it must be bad. But they actually don't know that for their organisation. I think it's also quite a nice example where you also need multiple sources of evidence. So even if you have external evidence of a scientific kind that makes that claim, it doesn't mean it's going to be true in your organisation. It may make engagement scores may make no difference to your performance. It doesn't mean it never does.
Yeah, it could be role specific or industry specific.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So surveys, is there a value to an engagement survey or not?
Broadly speaking, if you place engagement surveys in the category of employee attitude surveys, in general, I sort of struggle to understand their purpose, both scientifically and both practically. And obviously, they've been around. If you look at sort of a lot of the items that are typically used to measure engagement in lots of surveys, those are items around things like commitment or kind of feedback, other kinds of things. So those items, more or less, those surveys have been around for 60 or 70 years. Are they important? I'm not saying they're unimportant, but it depends on what the problem is. It depends on what you think their issue is. So sure, you can measure people's attitudes at work. They go up and down a bit. They differ between people. Maybe they correlate a little bit with stuff. But what's the problem? What is that helping us do? And that's always the missing, scientifically, but what's it helping us do? So, for example, if you see a small association between commitment to, say, performance, so what?
Well, I mean, it's all about, again, it's HR trying to show commercial value. So if you're the sales director, you can show that the numbers you're bringing. If you're the FD, you can savings.
Yeah.
So it's HR trying to have a metric that they can show value.
Yes.
And I assume, and there's therefore, because you've got that might be quite annoying.
I think that's Tower Bridge going up.
Okay, that's Tower Bridge going up. So that noise in the background was the Tower Bridge potentially going up and may restart. So I suppose my view is that it's about HR trying to demonstrate commercial value again, and it's a metric. And I think obviously there is an assumption, therefore, that if people are happier, they're either going to perform better or they're not going to leave. Yeah, and both of those have tangible costs.
And you just made the point. There's an assumption, and that's fine, but you need to test it for your organisation. Yeah, because I think, and I get their point about there's numbers and you can see them going up or down, but in the end, you have to show those things you're measuring are actually important, and also you have to be able to show you can affect it. So, for example, if you said, what's the evidence that you can intervene to increase organisational commitment? I don't know.
Yeah, no, this is one which I think is throwing that back, because you can get to the point where you go, all right, what's the point in my job? Because if I can't prove it makes a difference, then what do I do? So where is the good evidence?
I think that's a very good question for any profession. Yeah.
So then, in HR, where are the areas? So I'm going into HR. Where is the good evidence? Where should I focus my energy?
Okay, so I would say again, that's the wrong place to start. What's the problem?
Okay.
You don't start with, it's a bit like saying, you're in an organisation, I've got loads of organisational data. Where's there lots of organisational data? I know. I'll go and look where there's lots of data, and that's my focus. Well, hold on. What's the problem?
But it's a bit chicken and egg, though, isn't it? Because if we're saying that I can't solve certain problems, what I'm saying is, which are the problems that I'm most likely to be able to use an evidence-based solution for?
I think any problem.
No? Okay. So
any at all. Yeah. I think Okay, so that's in a sense working backwards. A bit like saying, it's not like saying, say, I don't like using medical analogies, but it's like saying, okay, in which area of medicine is there strong evidence that stuff works? You go, it's in treating pain. Oh, okay. Then what we'll do is we'll go around and treat everyone's pain. But hold on, these people don't have pain. Yeah, but that's what works. But they don't have pain. So you have to start with what the issue or problem is. And you can take an evidence-based approach to anything.
Okay, so again, going back to my pragmatic, I'll push on this one because we've got people out here going, well, so I'm going to do nothing. So
no, they're not going to do anything. No, they're not going to do anything. They're going to do something. They're going to find, they're going to do two things. They're going to address important business, organisational problems and opportunities, number one. Number two, they're going to do stuff that's more likely to work. That is the only thing we should be doing.
But I'm not going to do a survey.
No, you might. It depends
if it works.
No, you might. Of course you can do a survey. You can do anything you like, but you don't start with a technique. You don't start with a phenomenon. You start with what's important for this organisation.
Yeah.
And how do I know it's important? And what's the evidence for that from multiple sources? And if I'm fairly clear, it seems very likely that is quite a serious problem for this business organisation, or it's a good opportunity, then what is the evidence from multiple sources about what's the most likely solution? That's what you do.
So if I was going to go, and I don't know if this is a problem, but because I think I'm going to sit forwards, back, and again, so I'm pushing my history, my thinking maybe. The situation problem is that the organisation wants to perform, wants to have greater performance, greater output from people performance. So I appreciate that's kind of forwards as opposed to a diagnostic problem. And the reason I'm coming up with that, because we got someone to do a research review of what actually drove performance, because I wanted to know, because of the business that I run, is there any evidence as to you can influence it? And the things that came out, it's goal setting. Goal setting and feedback was one of the more rigorous ones in terms of seeing a correlation with performance. Do you agree with that in terms of?
It depends what kind of performance you mean, and it depends on the context.
Right. So I'm
going to push back on you and say you always have to be specific.
Yeah.
Because you're right. If you said which motivational technique is there the most evidence for, absolutely, it's goal setting. If you said, is that going to work here? Different question.
Might not.
If you say, is this going to be a disaster here? Yeah, it could be. Is this the worst possible thing to do in this organisation? Yes, it could be. So again, it's working back. You don't say where's the lots of evidence, what in inverted commas works. You say what is the problem. Go back to that performance issue. There's lots of different kinds of performance. To say we want the organisation or the staff within it to perform better is so vague.
Yeah.
It's just it's not a problem. Are you saying there's 10% who are not performing very well? Are you saying there's 50%? Are you talking about contextual performance or systematic behaviour? You're talking about service performance, you're talking about task performance. What kind of performance you talk about? Before we talk about performance dynamics, what do you actually mean?
Yeah.
And what makes you think it could get better? What a bizarre assumption. Maybe it can't, or not by much. So why are you throwing all these resources and trying to improve performance? Maybe you can do it by 2%. Maybe 2% really matters. Maybe 2% is irrelevant. So you have to understand and diagnose what the issue or problem is first. And it may turn out, after all that indeed, something like goal setting to increase one particular kind of behaviour or performance for one group of employees in one context, given there is a deficit which you think is changeable, is really a good idea.
Okay.
But you don't know that until you've done all the other work. So in other words, as Einstein apparently didn't say, if he had whatever it is, 24 hours to save the world, he would spend 23 hours diagnosing the problem and 1 hour implementing the solution. I think what people do, not just in HR, L&D, lots of areas of practice, is it's completely reversed. Yeah. They spend 1 hour thinking about the problem, 23 hours trying to say, what should we do? Let's do this. What works? What's great? Wrong way around. You have to start with the problem. And that, as I said, that to me is one of the hardest things about being evidence-based.
Yes.
It's not doing stuff. Anybody can do stuff. It's saying what is the issue or problem we're actually facing, and do we really understand what that is and what we want to do first, and do that, a clear line between that and what are we going to do about it. Don't even think about what we're going to do about it. What's the issue? And broadly speaking, my sense is, it's just hard. It's harder to do.
It is hard because you're being paid to do a job and people want to see action potentially.
Yeah, people think action is doing stuff and thinking isn't doing stuff, which is just bizarre, because actually doing stuff is really easy. Thinking is quite tough, and thinking is doing stuff, of course.
That's why we're all doing things and you're busy thinking. This is the real reason for the academic HR.
It is. Well, you'd be surprised. Given the performance demands placed on academics now, I think there is less thinking going on.
Yeah.
There's more doing. What's my next study? What's my next paper? There's not a ton of thinking in terms of there's lots of action.
Yeah. We work with a couple of universities, so that makes sense too. Okay, well, this is great. So I've very much got I still would feel a little bit stuck, but I realise that there's not obvious solutions.
Well,
it's challenging.
I would say feeling stuck I would say if you don't feel stuck, you're not doing it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You have to feel stuck, because by feeling stuck, you push, you say, what's going on? I don't understand. I don't get it. It's like not knowing stuff. Not knowing stuff is great because you ask questions. And the same is true with feeling stuck. I feel stuck. I don't understand what's going on. What's happening? Fantastic. That is great. Because at that point, when you feel stuck, you'll start pushing. Obviously, if you give up, that's a different issue. But if you start pushing, the danger is when you don't feel stuck, when you're sure everything's fine, everything's going right, you know exactly what you're doing, everything's wonderful, that's dangerous.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's actually, I just saw a parallel there with what you're saying between that and coaching. And again, people will often come and say, this is what I want to talk about. And actually, half an hour into it, you actually realise what the problem is.
Yes.
It's much deeper down. Or counselling or anything like that, where people unwrap it.
Yeah.
And so I suppose as a practical takeaway, if I'm an HR or an L&D professional and I'm going consulting with someone in my business and they're saying, I want this solution, what the best thing we can do in that situation is just keep challenging and go, so what is the actual problem? What's the evidence of the problem? To keep digging down as opposed to jumping straight into solution mode and I'm going to go and magic wand it.
Yeah.
Go on.
I was going to say one way sort of those two questions I asked before, do you want to do what's important? Do you want to do what's more likely to work? They kind of get it. It's mother and apple. No one disagrees with that. So it's okay. Let's think about what's actually important.
Yeah.
What do you think? So you think the problem is, as you said, the example you gave before, these people need development. Okay, but what's the problem?
Yeah.
That's fine. What's the problem?
Why? Yeah.
Go, let's find out what the problem is first. What we think it might be, or the most likely problem or opportunities. Then when we can look across multiple sources, we're fairly confident that that's what's going on. Now we can start talking about what we can do about it.
And I think one thing that is worth making is it's not just about sort of looking backwards, because I think if you have a problem, it can feel like looking backwards. And because it's also about what's the problem in the context of where the business is trying to go. So we want to break into this new market, or we need completely new skills. So the problem is we won't be competitive if we carry on like this. So it is about, that's for me is this piece about problem solving, but also being strategic. So asking the person you're talking about the future aspect of it.
But in a sense,
that's the why.
Absolutely, you can only look forward on the basis of historical data. So if you're anticipating you won't be competitive, well, what's that? What's that based on? A hunch?
Well, I can give an example there where the particular marketplace was changing. So you had people with old sort of telecom skills, and it was moving into a digital marketplace.
Oh, sure,
so
but that's what I'm saying. You still need to look back to look forward.
Yeah.
As it's not random. You haven't invented it. You're projecting forward on the basis of what's happened historically.
Yeah.
So I think looking back and looking forward is the same thing. I mean, you have to look back to look forward.
Yeah, as a
and
natural
vice
link.
versa.
Yeah. Okay, right. So I've kept you talking, and we've got the bridge going again there. Just a few kind of quick fire ones, I suppose, if there's anything to get out of it. Although I've got most of them here. What's your worst HR fad or jargon?
Worst?
What really kind of?
I don't know. It varies a lot. Gosh.
What's your current?
The current thing I find quite jarring is employee experience. Because it's not those, I just don't know what it means.
I was just going to say, what does it mean?
And when I've seen definitions, so I got an email the other day from a conference saying something like, employee experience is the sum total of everything the employee experiences from when they first know the organisation, to applying for a job, to going to work there, to what it feels like to be there, to their laptop, their computer, their IT, their physical environment.
It's brand as well as it, employee brand.
I don't know, but for some people then it says, how does all this link to the bottom line? Come and learn. So how does everything link to the okay? So I'm not sure what it means. So it's sort of annoying just because it's quite hard to pin people down to what it means. And I think when people say, oh, it doesn't matter what you call it, it's always a red flag to me. Like, hold on, if you don't even know what this is, you literally don't know what you're talking about. Because it's kind of everything. So at the moment, and I think also it's happened because it's taken over from employee engagement.
Yeah, it's kind of one.
Yeah.
So again, going back to one of your things you put about appraisals, they're pretty dead things in many ways. There's no criticism about them, but so one of your articles you sort of said, we could just chuck them out the window. What would you replace them with? Nothing? Well,
it depends what you're trying to do. It depends what the problem is. So I think annual appraisals can probably have some sort of purpose, but it depends what you're trying to achieve. So to put it at one extreme, you could say, well, why bother to evaluate people's performance at all? what's the point?
Yeah, and generally it might be for pay. That's one of the reasons for that.
It may be, and it may be in some contexts it's totally unnecessary. Maybe some contexts are very hard to do. So again, when it comes back to saying what should we do around performance appraisal, that's starting with a solution you think isn't working. But what are the problems you need to address, or opportunities around performance? And it may involve some kind of appraisal. It may be nothing to do with that. Mm-hmm. So it may be weekly conversations, it may be measuring stuff, it may be giving people feedback, it may be selecting people differently. So I think, again, you have to start not with the technique, but with what the issue is.
Yeah. And the reality is that you can't end up with a void. Well, you could end up with a void, but that could be even worse. But I suppose until you do these things, you don't quite know what is going to be the impact.
What's the void?
Well, I'm just thinking, do you replace it with something? I think where people go, our appraisal's dead, chuck it out, and you go,
oh yeah, of course,
fine.
Yeah.
But okay, so do nothing? Are you really thinking that people are going to I think that's a nonsense, really. Do you actually think that managers are therefore going to have weekly conversations just because they want to? Everyone's so busy. I just don't think that would happen. So I think there has to be some sort of guidance, actually, in terms of what people should do in an organisation. What works for one organisation is different from another, and some of that's about the culture of the organisation as much as as to the practicalities. So some of them just wouldn't talk regularly. Some people would go, actually, it's only appropriate to have a conversation every quarter. I mean, you just sort of, as an academic, the universities that I work with, I'm actually, it's a bit like medics. Actually, you're kind of a totally different entity in terms of performance management, or viewed as such by HR in universities compared to operational staff. And I don't know if that's because it's kind of an individual thinking role, it's an expert role. And I can't imagine, you probably hate appraisals in academic scenarios. But I think I'm digressing there. I think I've asked you this question already, and I don't think you gave me an answer to it, so I'm not sure whether you'll give me an answer if I ask it to you again. But I was going to say, because you'll say, what's the problem, I think is your answer. So if the answer isn't what's the problem, where is the strongest evidence in HR for practice? What have you been most impressed by in terms of evidence?
I just don't tend to think like that. Because I'm not ranking a whole list of random HR practices and saying, for which one of these practices for totally different things is the most evidence. I just don't.
You don't think like that?
No, because I think, and again, scientific, I think it's not very useful because, for example, certainly in terms of research, there's often a lot of evidence about something just because it's fashionable in academia. And there's often not much evidence about something that's really important. So I think it's...
Because people have had chance to research, have all gone on that.
In other words, it's kind of misleading to say, look at... It's misleading to say, because we're not so much interested in quantity, we're interested in quality. Mm-hmm. So there may be a lot of evidence for some sorts of things. It doesn't mean that's better than anything else. Mm-hmm. It just means a lot of evidence for it. So.
And that loops us back to how we started in many ways. So if we want to try and look for quality and quickly, systematic reviews is the best place to go.
Systematic people tend to do that. They'll say, how many studies are there? What quality are they? What are they showing? Are they showing clear effects, consistent effects, mixed effects? And even sometimes if there's very mixed effects, it doesn't mean that practice technique isn't useful, but what the mixed effects might be telling you, as you said before, it's very contingent on context.
Yeah.
So again, some people sometimes sort of say, well, it's very mixed effects, therefore it doesn't work. No, it means it works differently in different situations. Understanding how and why it does that is a different issue. But I mean, mixed effects isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's often seen as meaning, it doesn't really work.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to say thank you very much for your time, Professor Rob Briner.
Okay.
And I got it right, have I? At the end. That's the conclusion of our HR Uprising podcast. Hopefully the sound effects were enjoyable as opposed to completely distracting. I found that really, really
it's great.
interesting.
Thank you very much.
I really appreciate having you on. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast. You can access more information, including resources or links mentioned in the show, at our website, www.hruprising.com. Also, you might want to join our LinkedIn community or tweet to us at HR Uprising. We'd love to hear from you.